We're coming from John, the 21st chapter, starting with the 15th verse, ending with the 17th verse. That's John, the 21st chapter, starting with the 15th verse, ending with the 17th verse. I'll be reading from the New Revised Standard Version, starting with verse 15. When they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? He said to him, Yes, Lord. You know that I love you. Jesus said to him, Feed my lambs. A second time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He said to him, Yes, Lord. You know that I love you. Jesus said to him, Tend my sheep. He said to him the third time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter felt hurt because he said to him the third time, Do you love me? And he said to him, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. Jesus said to him, Feed my sheep. We're coming from the topic today, practicing God. Practicing God. As a young boy growing up, I loved the neighborhood library. One of the most proudest days for me was when I got a new library card in the mail. I would cherish it and place it in my blue Superman Velcro wallet. Each week with pride, I would return books that I checked out and had read. And it was then that I would also pick up new books and find new materials. One school day afternoon, I was walking home. I decided to stop by the library. I wanted to see if they had changed the displays and see if anything new had come in for kids my age. I didn't have a lot of time this day to hang out and go into my quiet corner and read because I was due home at a certain time. As I passed through those double glass doors and looked to my left, there was Mr. Diggs, the head librarian. He was busy stamping books and placing them on carts that were next to him. I spoke and he looked up and out over those reading glasses and said, Hello there. You back early? Yeah, I said, I wanted to stop by before heading home. He nodded and returned to his books. I made my way down to my favorite section in the library, the young reader section. It was where the good stuff was. It was filled with books from authors like Julie Bloom and and Arnold Lobel and Raymond Briggs. These authors stayed in my book bag. But this new display was also by my section. I was fascinated by the displays, whether it was a Valentine's Day display or it was a Black History Month display or Women's History Month display. The displays always captivated me. And usually it had some new authors or a certain theme for the month on the table. But today it had just random authors, nothing too fancy, nothing too it was just random in the way in which they laid out this display. I looked and saw this book. It was small and it had a little Black girl on the cover. I hadn't encountered a book like that before. The title read The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison. I was fascinated. I grabbed it and turned it over to see who wrote it and what was it about. And I saw the author's face. I thought, the name Tony is like a boy name. Why would a mommy and daddy name a girl Tony? Even though with all of that, I was even more intrigued. I put it under my arm and kept looking down my usual aisle. And once I was done, I made my way back up from to the front to Mr. Diggs and gave him my book and my library card. He paused and said, This is not your usual choice, David. Are you sure? Yes, I said. I want to read it. He said, Well, David, it has things that may upset you. I said, Mr. Diggs, words don't scare me. He smiled and handed the book and my library card back to me. I made my way home did my homework, ate dinner, and decided to read the new book. I fell in love with Pecola Breed Love and the words of Toni Morrison. February is Black History Month, and we celebrated this past Friday what would have been the 91st birthday of the late Toni Morrison. I wanted to share with you a passage from her book, Paradise. And it reads, let me tell you about love. That silly word you believe is about whether you like somebody or whether somebody likes you or whether you can put up with somebody in order to get them to get something or someplace you want. Or you believe it has to do with how your body responds to another body, like robins or bison. Or maybe you believe love is how forces or nature or luck is benign to you, in particular, not naming or also killing you, but if so, doing it for your own good. Love is none of that. There is nothing in nature like it, not in robins or bison or in the banging tails of your hunting dogs, and not in blossoms or suckling foal. Love is divine only and difficult always. If you think it is easy, you are a fool. If you think it is natural, you are blind. It is a learned application without reason or motive, except that it is God. You do not deserve love, regardless of the suffering you have endured. You do not deserve love because somebody did you wrong. You do not deserve love just because you want it. You can only earn by practice and careful contemplation the right to express it, and you have to learn how to accept it, which is to say, you have to earn God. You have to practice God. You have to think God carefully. And if you are good and diligent and a diligent student, you may secure the right to love. Love is not a gift, it is a diploma conferring certain privileges, the privilege of expressing love and the privilege of receiving love. Paradise by Toni Morrison. And John, the 21st chapter of John opens with a fishing scene. Peter and his disciples are fishing and they're not having a good catch so far. They are basically, the nets are empty, as they say. You go out and you realize that you're trying to fish and nothing shows up. So that's where Peter and his fellow disciples are fishing. And that's the problem they incurred on the water. Peter is a master fisherman. It was in doing his vocation that he encountered Jesus the very first time in earlier texts. So fishing and water is important. And it's also important to Peter's identity. The encounter with Jesus is after the crucifixion and the resurrection. The story says that they thought they recognized him while they were out on the boat. This is Jesus's third time returning back to his disciples. As they make their way to the other side, Jesus saw them and Jesus broke bread with them. He fed them and gave them clear directions. It was a powerful moment for Peter. Jesus has a way of asking clarifying questions to his disciples. In this moment, we see him ask Peter 3 times, Peter, do you love me? I found it interesting that earlier Peter had denied him 3 times and that Jesus rose on the third day and that this is Jesus' third time visiting the disciples since his resurrection. And now he asked Peter 3 times, do you love me? Before we dive into those directives, I want to point out that a recent Pew poll indicates that 65% of American adults, identify as Christian. They claim Jesus as their Lord and Savior. But if we look at how those tenets are practiced, we see something completely opposite of what it means to be Christian. But I digress. Jesus challenges Peter by first identifying with him the very thing that he loves, and that is fishing. Do you love me more than this? Do you identify with your career more than you do with your calls or perhaps your calling? Jesus is getting Peter to get real clear real fast. Do you love me? And Peter answered him, Yes, Lord, I love you. He answered him like that 3 times. And after each question, Jesus gave Peter some directives. He said, Feed my lamb, tend to my sheep, feed my sheep. I asked my niece, who is in veterinarian school, about this. And she said, I said, yes. I said, I need to ask you a question. Um, what's the order of the day for most animals? She says, well, if you're dealing with livestock, you got to feed them, you got to tend to them. She said, you got to feed them again. Well, she didn't say 10. She says, you have to create the environment for animals to thrive. I said, oh, like tending. She said, yeah, like gotta nurture them. You gotta make sure that they have everything that they need in their nature to actually be the animal that they are naturally. And she says, and you gotta feed them. And you gotta feed them more than once. I said, wow, I never thought about it like that. And so we hung up and we moved on. And Jesus uses that same frame because we're dealing with a agricultural climate. It's an agrarian culture. They're eating and live off the land. So it makes sense that Jesus will give Peter these directives from that very place of the culture. You got to feed them, you got to tend to them, and you got to feed them again. And so after I hung up from my niece, I thought about, what does it mean to feed my lamb? Lamb meaning the younger version of a sheep, the babies, the infants, the vulnerable ones. And Jesus says, feed them. Are we feeding them, these lambs, the young, the vulnerable, the children? How are we feeding them here in America? By eliminating the child tax credit, which now ensures that 12.6 million children will stay in poverty. Are we feeding them when teachers are constantly under attack in public education and resources and funding are being cut and compromised? Are we feeding them when we ban books, disrupt school board meetings to argue about critical race theory, and create hostile work environments within school districts across the country? When we feed the lambs, we feed them by encouraging them, paying parents a livable wage, paying teachers and administrators very well. We feed them by creating and maintaining good food sources, safe drinking water, and modern classrooms, and not creating schools that mimic prisons. We feed them by giving words of encouragement, nurturing them, creating safe and loving homes for them. Jesus asks us to feed the lambs. Secondly, he asks us not only to feed the lamb, but he also says, feed the sheep. How are we taking care of our elders? How are we taking care of our seniors? Are we feeding them when seniors have to choose most days between medicine and food? Are we feeding them when Medicaid and Medicare is not enough to cover most medical costs? Are we feeding them when by 2050, America will have almost over 100,000 seniors without stable housing? We feed them by providing them with the basic material needs so they can thrive and be of service to the larger community. We feed them by providing them an economic floor for safety, a safety net for all seniors so they can stay in their homes if they choose to. Not only is he asking us to feed the lamb, he's also asking us to feed the sheep. And lastly, Jesus says, tend to my sheep, which is essentially saying, pay attention to the needs of others, help people, serve humanity, listen to people, check in on your neighbors, give, teach, encourage, laugh, pray, sing, have meaningful exchanges with others. We have within our power to lift as we climb. That's what Jesus is asking of us when we tend to one another, when we check in on each other, when we're tender and kind and gentle and also challenging. Tend to my sheep. And when we do this, Toni Morrison says something special happens. If we are going to practice God, we must feed the little lamb. We must feed the sheep and tend to the sheep. If we're going to think God, we must be willing to be a thinking Christian with an analysis and a critical eye and a critical ear towards all things. And Toni Morrison says, and if we are good, and if we are diligent, she says we graduate. When we practice God, when we think God, when we feed the lamb, when we feed the sheep, and when we tend to the sheep, we practice God. Thank you for listening.